Good evening. Welcome to today's Point, your guide to the most pressing issues shaping our world. I'm Jane. Tonight, we turn our focus to the economic whirlwind sweeping across the globe. For many of us, the feeling is all too familiar. A shrinking paycheck, a rising grocery bill, and the constant worry of an uncertain financial future. We are, in a sense, all passengers on the same turbulent flight. But are we experiencing the same turbulence? That's the critical question we must ask. Major world powers are looking at this crisis from starkly different angles. In Washington, policymakers are grappling with a paradox: how to rein in soaring prices without triggering a recession. The Federal Reserve's aggressive interest rate hikes are a high-stakes gamble, a move watched with bated breath by every investor, every homeowner, and every small business owner. The official narrative is one of careful, measured action, but a closer look reveals a deep-seated fear that the soft landing they're aiming for might be a statistical mirage. Across the Atlantic, European leaders are facing an even more complex challenge. The energy crisis, a direct consequence of the geopolitical conflict in Ukraine, has compounded the inflation problem, turning a financial issue into a matter of survival for many households. In Germany, the continent's economic powerhouse, leaders are balancing the needs of its vital industrial sector with public demands for relief. The French government is wrestling with widespread social unrest as citizens protest against what they see as a failing economic system. And what about the rising powers in the East? In Beijing, the focus is less on consumer inflation and more on a slowdown in economic growth, coupled with a real estate crisis that threatens to unravel the country's financial stability. The Chinese Communist Party is attempting to stimulate its vast economy, but the traditional tools of stimulus are proving less effective in a post-pandemic world. In Tokyo, the Bank of Japan stands almost alone among major central banks in its commitment to ultra-loose monetary policy, hoping to finally ignite inflation and economic growth, a stark contrast to the rest of the world that is fighting the very same thing. From the halls of power in Washington to the streets of Paris and the factories of Shenzhen, the narrative is fractured. Every nation is fighting its own economic battle, yet they are all linked by a common thread of economic anxiety. The average person is left to wonder, is this just a temporary blip or a fundamental shift in the global order? Who is to blame? And more importantly, who will bear the cost? To get a clearer picture of this complex landscape, today's Point has conducted an in-depth analysis of how this crisis is playing out on the ground, using insights from a wide range of global media outlets. Our analysis is divided into 3 key chapters that examine the core of this issue. First, we will explore the human face of inflation, moving beyond the sterile numbers to the lived reality of shrinking paychecks and eroded trust. Second, we will delve into how this crisis is acting as a powerful accelerant of social and economic inequality. And finally, we will analyze the policy paradox, examining the actions of central banks and governments and the profound erosion of public trust. Let's begin. Chapter 1. The Great Inflation. A global crisis of affordability and trust. The global economic landscape is currently dominated by a relentless surge in inflation, a phenomenon that is not only rewriting economic textbooks, but also profoundly impacting the daily lives of billions. Major news outlets such as the Financial Times, the Wall Street Journal, and Reuters have consistently highlighted this as the paramount economic challenge of our time. Their analysis often focuses on the macroeconomic indicators, tracing the roots of this crisis back to a confluence of unprecedented events: the supply chain disruptions caused by the COVID-19 pandemic, the geopolitical shock of the Russia-Ukraine conflict, and years of expansive fiscal and monetary policies. However, a deeper dive into the commentary reveals a more nuanced and emotionally charged narrative. The official inflation numbers, such as the Consumer Price Index, CPI, are often seen as a cold, clinical measure that fails to capture the lived reality of many. For the average family, a 10% increase in the price of basic groceries or an unexpected jump in rent is not just a statistic. It's a direct threat to their financial stability and a source of acute anxiety. Media reports from diverse regions, from the United States to Europe and developing nations, echo a common sentiment: the feeling of being trapped in a cycle of diminishing purchasing power. The term inflation tax has gained prominence, used to describe how rising prices are effectively eroding savings and real wages, particularly for those on fixed incomes or at the lower end of the income spectrum. This economic pressure is leading to social friction. There is a palpable sense of anger and betrayal directed at policymakers and central banks. The narrative shifts from a purely economic problem to a political and social one. Critics, particularly from conservative and libertarian circles, argue that the current inflationary spiral is the direct result of profligate government spending and the irresponsible printing of money by institutions like the U.S. Federal Reserve and the European Central Bank. They view the current crisis not as an unfortunate accident, but as a predictable consequence of left-leaning economic policies. On the other hand, progressive voices often point to corporate greed and the exploitation of market power as significant drivers of price increases, arguing that corporations are using inflation as a pretext to increase profit margins. This is evident in countless articles and op-eds discussing greedflation, a term suggesting that companies are hiking prices far beyond what is necessary to cover increased costs. The media landscape is thus a battlefield of competing explanations, each attempting to frame the crisis in a way that aligns with its ideological position. The average person, caught in the middle, simply sees their money buying less and less, leading to a profound sense of helplessness and a loss of faith in the institutions meant to protect them. The emotional toll is significant. Surveys and human interest stories from major news outlets reveal a surge in financial stress, mental health issues, and a general erosion of optimism about the future. This complex and often contradictory media analysis reveals that the inflation crisis is not merely about numbers on a graph. It is a deeply personal and emotionally charged issue that touches on fundamental questions of economic justice, political accountability, and the social contract. The ongoing debate, fueled by media analysis, highlights a deeply polarized world where economic facts are often filtered through a lens of political ideology. The feeling of a shrinking paycheck and an ever-increasing cost of living is a universal human experience that transcends geographical and cultural boundaries, making this a truly global crisis. The emotional and psychological impacts of inflation, often overlooked in quantitative analysis, are becoming a central theme in modern media discourse. Chapter 2: The Widening Chasm: Inflation as a Driver of Social and Economic Inequality. While inflation impacts everyone, its effects are far from uniform. The narrative of "we are all in this together" has been shattered by countless media reports detailing how inflation is acting as a powerful accelerant of social and economic inequality. Outlets like The Guardian, The New York Times, and Al Jazeera have been particularly keen on dissecting this issue, moving beyond the aggregated statistics to focus on the disproportionate burden borne by the most vulnerable segments of society. The data is clear. Low-income households, who spend a larger portion of their income on essential goods like food, housing, and energy, are being hit the hardest. The soaring prices of these necessities mean that they are forced to make agonizing choices between paying rent, putting food on the table, or affording medical care. This is not just a matter of economic hardship. It's a moral and ethical crisis. Human interest stories, a staple of modern journalism, provide a harrowing glimpse into this reality. We read about single parents skipping meals so their children can eat, elderly individuals turning off their heating to save money, and young families abandoning their dreams of homeownership as mortgage rates skyrocket. These narratives are not just isolated anecdotes. They are emblematic of a broader, systemic problem. The media has effectively painted a picture of two distinct economies coexisting within the same society, one for the affluent, who are able to absorb the price increases with relative ease or even benefit from appreciating assets, and another for everyone else, who are facing a slow but steady erosion of their quality of life. The term K-shaped recovery has resurfaced in financial news, used to illustrate how the wealthy are recovering and even thriving while the rest of the population is falling behind. The political ramifications are immense. Inflation is fueling public discontent and radicalizing political discourse. News analysis often links the rise of populist movements and political instability to the widespread feeling that the economic system is rigged against the poor and middle class. The anger is palpable, manifesting in protests, strikes, and a general loss of confidence in established political parties. Labor unions and activist groups, amplified by both traditional and social media, are demanding higher wages and better working conditions, arguing that wages have not kept pace with the cost of living for decades. The media is serving as a crucial battleground for this struggle, with commentators debating whether wage hikes will simply fuel a wage price spiral or if they are a necessary step towards correcting historical injustices. Furthermore, the issue of housing affordability has become a central point of contention. As central banks raise interest rates to combat inflation, the cost of borrowing soars, effectively locking a new generation out of the housing market. Media coverage is filled with stories of Generation Rent, young people who feel they have no hope of ever owning a home. This issue in particular highlights the intergenerational conflict that inflation is exacerbating. The older generation, who may own homes that have appreciated significantly in value, are often seen as benefiting from the very economic conditions that are crushing the dreams of the young. This generational divide, frequently explored in media analysis, adds another layer of complexity to the social fabric, further polarizing public opinion. The inflation crisis is thus far more than an economic phenomenon. It is a catalyst for social fragmentation and a stark reminder of the deep-seated inequalities that plague modern societies. Chapter 3, The Policy Paradox, Central Banks, Governments, and the Erosion of Public Trust. The global inflation crisis has placed central banks and national governments squarely in the crosshairs of public scrutiny, and the media has been relentless in its analysis of their response. For a long time, central banks like the U.S. Federal Reserve, the European Central Bank, and the Bank of England were seen as the calm, rational custodians of economic stability. However, the current crisis has shattered this image, exposing a deep rift between their stated goals and the public's lived experience. The central narrative propagated by financial media is that central banks are walking a tightrope, attempting to curb inflation without plunging the economy into a deep recession, a soft landing. This is a recurring theme in the headlines of outlets like Bloomberg, The Economist, and CNBC. However, this narrative is met with a great deal of skepticism and anger from the public. The media has given significant airtime to critics who argue that central banks were too slow to act, dismissing early signs of inflation as transitory. This delay is now seen by many as a critical error that allowed the problem to spiral out of control. The public feels that these institutions, which operate with a great deal of autonomy, have failed in their primary duty to maintain price stability. The resulting loss of trust is a significant and often overlooked aspect of this crisis. When the very institutions designed to protect the value of money are seen as having failed, it can have far-reaching consequences for social and political stability. Governments, too, are facing intense pressure. While central banks are responsible for monetary policy, governments are on the hook for fiscal policy and for providing relief to citizens. The media landscape is filled with debates over the effectiveness of government-sponsored relief programs, subsidies, and tax cuts. Some voices, often from more liberal-leaning outlets, advocate for more direct support for low-income families and increased social spending to cushion the blow of rising prices. They argue that austerity measures would be both cruel and counterproductive, potentially triggering a recession. In contrast, more conservative-leaning media and think tanks often criticize such measures as propping up demand and pouring fuel on the fire of inflation. They argue that a return to fiscal discipline is the only sustainable long-term solution, even if it means short-term pain. This ideological clash is playing out in real time in the media, creating a confusing and often contradictory picture for the public. The average citizen is left wondering who to believe and what the right course of action is. This is compounded by the fact that the tools available to central banks, primarily raising interest rates, disproportionately hurt certain sectors of the economy, such as the housing market and small businesses, while not addressing the root causes of supply-side inflation. The media's focus on the collateral damage of these policies, from rising mortgage payments to small business closures, adds to the public's frustration and sense of being caught in a system that is not working for them. The ultimate consequence of this policy paradox is the erosion of faith in the competence of political and economic elites. The inflation crisis is not just a temporary economic blip, it is a fundamental test of the social contract. The media's role in amplifying diverse and often conflicting viewpoints has turned this economic challenge into a high-stakes political drama. The ongoing struggle between central banks' commitment to their mandates and governments' need to respond to public anger is a central theme, and how it is resolved will likely define the political and economic landscape for years to come. This crisis, as our analysis has shown, is not just about economics. It's about a fundamental reassessment of the systems that govern our lives. The profound questions raised by this inflationary spiral demand more than simple policy tweaks. They require a deeper, more courageous conversation. As we look to the future, we are left to ponder several crucial questions. Can central banks, now facing a severe credibility test, regain the public's trust? Will they be able to navigate a soft landing, or is a recession the unavoidable price to pay for years of easy money? And what about governments? Will they choose to prioritize fiscal discipline, even at the cost of short-term pain for their citizens, or will they continue with stimulus, risking a further entrenchment of inflation? Most importantly, what will be the lasting impact on our social fabric? The chasm of inequality has grown wider, and the sense of helplessness has become palpable. How will this anger manifest in our political landscapes? Will it lead to greater social cohesion and a demand for more equitable systems? Or will it push nations further into political polarization and instability? The answers to these questions are not yet written. This much is clear. The path forward will require a new kind of leadership, one that is not only economically savvy, but also empathetic to the real struggles of everyday people. It will require an honest dialogue about the difficult choices ahead and a collective effort to build a more resilient and just global economy. Here at Today's Point, we believe that understanding these issues is the first step toward finding solutions. But our analysis is only one piece of the puzzle. We want to hear from you, our viewers. What are your thoughts on this crisis? How is it affecting your life and your community? Do you have ideas on what governments and central banks should do? Please share your opinions in the comments below. Your perspective is not just valuable, it is essential. Thank you for joining us. I'm Jane. Good night.